Alright, so let's move on to Deontic entities. So now we have to try and solve the problem of obligations. And we'll quote Shapiro again. We can have laws, but, legal officials have to follow those laws. But you can't add a law to the legal system which says legal officials have to follow this law, because then your question would arise, well, why should they follow that law? So there's a puzzle. What is it that legitimates legal authority? In virtue of what do legal officials have to follow the law? Now, this is because there's something prior to law, which is a willingness to accept something like obligations, which is not codified, not conceptualized, but which people seem to have. Now, similarly, people have a willingness to be fair when dividing up cake between their children, for instance. So there are various pre-legal, pre-formal expectations which we can have about human beings, which form the realm of customary law, or whatever it is which is the foundation of law, and which includes, for instance, the expectation that married couples will be faithful to each other. It includes the expectation that people will not kill each other. So very many obligations of this sort are general and universal, and they're just part of the way humans are. Now, I'm not going to be talking about that. I'm not saying that's the easy part, but that's the part that we have to presuppose. That's not a result of documents, because it was there generations before there were any documents. So the disposition to divide fairly, the disposition to look down on people who fail to divide fairly. All right, so how do we deal with obligations? I'm dealing primarily with obligations which are brought about because of formal or ritual procedures which may or may not involve documents. So making a promise gives rise to an obligation. That's my prime case. And it doesn't have to be a written contract, it can just be a simple utterance. What is an obligation? Now, BFO doesn't have any role, any place, any obvious place anyway to put obligations. But Aristotle doesn't have any obvious place either. So we're not absolutely in a uniquely bad place. Now Searle, as we saw, says that to understand obligation, you just need to understand speech acts, basta. That will solve the problem. People speak in certain ways. And in some formulations of Searle's view, it goes something like this. If you want to play chess, you have to play by the rules. If you want to speak English, you have to speak by the rules. And the rules say, if you say, I promise to do such and such, you become obliged to do such and such. And if you don't follow that rule, you're not speaking English. And so, that's what, in some interpretations, his view amounts to. I don't think we can do very much better than that, but I think we can do a little bit better. So we'll go back again to what I said earlier about a language. A language is to be understood in terms of the linguistic competencies understood as dispositions in BFO, in the BFO sense, of all the people who speak it. And there is an obvious objection to this definition of what a language is, which is that it's circular, because it's here refers back to the language. But in its favour, I don't know of any better account. And as I tried to argue earlier, it gives a really good account of how languages work in relation to their dialects and in relation to their historical evolution. It explains historical evolution by looking at the ways in which individual competencies change over time. And of course, this only works for natural languages. It doesn't work for computer languages, for programming languages, or for artificial languages of other sorts. So this is a map of the languages of Europe which derive from Latin. So these are continental Romance languages. So we have Spanish ones, we have Italian ones, we have Sicilian ones, Romanian, Corsican, Sardinian, and so on. And these are. This is just an example to show the detail in which, but the detailed way in which the Basque language can be structured geographically, in the sense that so these are all zones in which a certain percentage of people speak Basque, but then there are also dialects which are closely related to Basque and which differ from Spanish, which is the majority language in the whole of Spain. This is in a certain part of Spain. And you see that really the only way in which we can understand what the languages are which are mapped here is by looking at what the individual competences are of the speakers of the language. But those individual competences are created by the teachers of the language. And so this is a map really of the number of children learning Basque in a formal context. And that goes hand in hand with all of the things I've been saying about drill and training and expertise. So this is where the Basque country is to be found. So it's across the French-Spanish border. And the Basque language is a set of dispositions, but these dispositions are maintained by mechanisms. TV, schools, newspaper publishers, and so on. Peer groups who ostracize people who speak Spanish or who speak Basque badly, and so forth. Dictionaries. And I like to compare this particular system, so this is a set of dispositions, but it's part of a system which includes various mechanisms for maintaining that set of dispositions. And this system I like to compare with the price system. For instance, the price system which functions on the currency exchange markets. So every day people go to work, people who work on these markets, and they have certain dispositions to raise the price of the euro or to lower the price of the dollar. But then they go into their office and all kinds of mechanisms are available to them which are going to influence the way they exercise those dispositions and also influences those dispositions themselves, so the price changes. The price changes not only because of the dispositions and decisions of the individuals involved, but also because of the system of mechanisms which interrelates them, primarily mechanisms which turn on the fact that if I try and sell you a euro, then you're going to have to accept my price, or I'm not going to succeed in selling it to you, and therefore I may have to lower the price, even way below my dispositions, if I want to make the deal at all. And so that the counterpart on the language side would be, I'm only going to be able to get away with a new coinage and thereby change the dispositions in the language if I get people who are listening to me to accept what I say rather than to ridicule what I say or just not hear what I say. So a system of laws is very similar. So I would say that we can understand the English legal system as the set of all dispositions of all the participants in that system, including the prisoners and the police, as well as the law courts and the secretaries and the judges and the solicitors and so forth. And that they too are faced with a certain balancing act between defense and prosecution, between judges and solicitors and so forth. All right, so we know where dispositions go in BFO. They are specifically dependent continuants, and aggregates of dispositions are just large dispositions. And then languages are instances of aggregates of dispositions. And now how do we understand obligations? Well, what we're going to do is to look at instances where obligations arise, and they involve instances, for instance, of signing contracts and of people going into a signing of a contract situation with certain expectations, dispositions, expertise, and so on. And we need to take account of a basic opposition in BFO between dispositions and roles. So dispositions rest on drill and training and expertise and of genetic endowment. Roles depend on instantaneous decisions on the part of employers or supervisors or examiners. So roles are very Searlean. They correspond to the instantaneous mind to world, world to mind direction. If I say you are the new director and I have the authority role, then you have the director role immediately because of what I said. But dispositions require a physical change. You get to have a disposition only if your brain, for instance, changes physically. Now, as I said, there are general dispositions which all human beings, broadly speaking, have. Disposition to care for your children, to make friends, to seek a mate, to be fair, and so on. To make promises, to make guarantees, to sign contracts. All of these are general dispositions which people like us have. Some of them because we are taught, drilled, some of them because it's just our genetic endowment. And some of it is because of the language learning. And Searle is right, I think, that language learning here plays a role. So we have general obligations to not steal, to not murder, to tell the truth, and so on. And so these are obligations that we have, but there are no underlying contracts. So these are background examples. They're not what we're focusing on. What we're focusing on are the kinds of obligations that the Undersecretary for Economy, Growth, Energy, Environment has to her boss, who is the Secretary of State. And that kind of obligation does require things like contracts or documents in there. But we'll focus on the simple case where John makes a promise. He acquires an obligation and Mary acquires an exactly corresponding claim. So claim and obligation go hand in hand. So where do they go in BFO? Well, this is the first starting point. So when John makes the promise, he immediately, just in virtue of making the promise, acquires the role of the person who is obliged. He has the obligor role. That's not the obligation, but it's part of the story of what the obligation involves. And Mary acquires the equal and opposite obligee. I'm not sure if it's obligee or obligee. Obligee.
Obligee sounds better.
Obligee.
It sounds better to me.
It sounds better to me. Philosophy is sometimes hard. Alright, so we have these roles, which we know what they are in BFO terms. But these roles have no pull. They have no oughtness about them. Roles are just categories. Searle knows exactly what they are. They're categories which people have because of certain linguistic events, but that doesn't give you any obligation. Searle thinks it does, but that's the weak place in Searle. So now let's look at dispositions. So in making the promise, John immediately, if he really made a promise, acquires the disposition to perform. That's what making a promise involves. Immediately you become disposed. You make the promise, you look Mary in the eye, your brain clicks over, and now you have the intention to do the thing you promised. And Mary acquires a disposition to monitor John. So she wants to check. She wants to blame him, claim her right because he promised. And now they're not quite equal and opposite, but they do go hand in hand. All right, so this is what we have so far. But now I think it's a bit more complicated. On John's part, we just have the disposition to do the thing. There'll be some kind of time expectation involved, or maybe a specified time, but it's pretty simple. On Mary's part, we have initial dispositions to monitor, but then in case of failure to perform, we have conditional dispositions which kick in if John really does fail to perform, and these are dispositions to blame and to shame and to punish. Now this is the role of the law, to bring about a remeshing when people deviate from the meshed action system. But now it won't quite work, because John still has the obligation, even if Mary doesn't care so much. So Mary may never reach this point. Mary may die before the time when the performance on the part of John was to occur. And so it can't be that the promise is dependent upon these dispositions actually existing. So we need to...
So what are the lines between the two?
That's dependence relations. And if you have two lines, that's a mutual dependence. And the lines going upwards are always is-a relations. So where is the obligation here? That's what's missing. So notice that BFO is a formal ontology, and so we're not really obliged to have obligation in a formal ontology because it's not a formal term. But we are obliged to have a peg from which to hang the obligation, because BFO claims to have all the formal categories you need to categorize all the material categories at lower levels. And we do not yet have a place from which to hang the term obligation. So, material ontology is about things which are domain specific, like contracts and dispositions to monitor or to blame or to perform. So that's BFO. That's the object part of BFO. We have object aggregates. And now we'll go back a little bit to terrorism. So I talked when we were dealing with terrorism about the grooming and the drill processes which produce in, I've forgotten what his name was now, in our friend, a religious belief and a skill as a warfighter. Now, this is very similar to Searle's account of how we acquire the ability to make promises and to acquire obligations. Namely, we go through the drill of learning a language and thereby acquire the possibility to make promises and the belief that promises will be fulfilled and so forth. And so, can we make use of this idea in order to do justice to what's going on with John and Mary? So the idea I want to focus on turns on the fact that it's not only Mary who needs to have, or who is able to have the disposition to monitor or blame or punish John if he fails to perform. That is a disposition spread across the society, just as the use of this linguistic ritual phrase, I promise to do X, is spread across society. So we can ground the obligation not only in Mary's dispositions, but in dispositions spread across a larger society. And I won't go into this, but Thomas Reid has some relevant ideas along these lines, which you can look at later. So, and Reiner has some relevant ideas. Austin gets closest. So, when I say I promise, I've not merely announced my intention, but by performing this ritual, I have bound myself to others and staked my reputation in a new way. And this new way, it goes like this. Someone who stakes his reputation in this way and turns out to be wrong is liable to be rounded on by others. That means hit with sticks. So John's obligation is grounded on the disposition on the part of either Mary or of the wider society. If there is no disposition on the wider society to blame or shun or just raise your eyebrows in a supercilious manner when people break their promises, there are no obligations. That's the thesis I want to defend. So the way we deal with obligation is to go to the dependence relation between the obligation on the part of John and the disposition on the part of the wider society to punish promise breakers. Now, punishing doesn't necessarily mean to be rounded on with sticks. It can be something as mild as looking with an evil eye, or looking with a certain glare, or gossiping, or just walking out of the room in disgust. So there are many, many grades of punishing, but providing there is a distributed tendency, a disposition in other words, to engage in such punishing when people break promises, obligations to perform will exist. This is the thesis I'm now defending.